Hey guys, oh my gosh, was my volume off? I am so sorry. I was over here talking for a good solid 5 minutes before I realized that the volume was off. My bad. Welcome to my channel, The Magical Solution. My name is Leilani. So we come here every Monday, right, for our book club. And we pick up where we left off with regards to the previous chapter. We try and do a chapter a night if possible. I read for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and then the last 10 minutes is for your guys' questions. So those of you who might be joining in for the very first time, this is sort of a book club dedicated to all spiritual matters, metaphysical matters, occult matters, etc., etc. And my goal is to read books for you guys, right? So we started off with the Allan Kardec series, which is sort of like the codex, if you will, for the religions or the philosophical practices of spiritualism, spiritism, spiritismo, etc. So we already read his first book, which is the Spirits book. We already read his second book, which is the Mediums book. And now we are on the Gospel according to Spiritism. Don't freak out. If you missed the first two books, that is okay. Go to my YouTube channel. They're all there on replay. You don't have to have listened to that in order to sit in on tonight's live. The information is pretty independent of itself, and you'll always get something good out of it no matter what. So I'm glad you guys are here. So let's get to it. Let me go here. Hello. Hey, Renee. What's up? I haven't seen you in forever. How you doing? Oh my goodness. That's so lovely. Who do we got here? Hello, Renee, too. So we had two Renees here, two different people, though. How are you? That's so great. All right, so let's get to it. We are on chapter 12. The chapter is entitled Love Your Enemies, right? And the subcategories for this chapter are render good for evil, discarnate enemies, if someone strikes your right cheek, offer him the other. And then, of course, the Spirit's teachings, which they're going to go over the ideas of vengeance and hatred and dueling and all that good stuff. So just to kind of recap what the Gospel according to Spiritism is. So basically what we are doing is we're picking apart the Bible, or Allan Kardec specifically from the perspective of Spiritism is picking apart the Bible. So that is what we are kind of getting through right now. So let's get to it. Rendering of good for evil. You have learned that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who persecute and malign you, so that you may be children of your Father who is in heaven, who makes the sun to rise on the good and the bad, and the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. For if you love only those who love you, what reward will you receive from it? Do not the publicans also do that? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing that others do not? Do not the publicans do the same? I say to you that if your justice is not more abundant than that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So that's a passage from Matthew chapter 5, verses 20, 43 to 47. Okay? Now the next part is Luke chapter 6, verses 32 to 36, and then we're going to break it apart. Okay? If you love only those who love you, what reward will you have, since even sinners also love those who love them? And if you do good only to those who do good to you, what reward will you have, since even sinners do the same thing? And if you lend only to those from whom you can expect the same favor, what reward will you have, since even sinners lend to each another in order to receive the same advantage? But as for you, Love your enemies, do good to all, and lend without expecting anything. And then your reward will be very great, and you will be the children of the Most High, who is good to integrate and even the wicked. Thus be full of mercy, just as your God is full of mercy. Right? So we're going to talk about this. And one of the things that they're bringing up here is like, if love towards one neighbor is the principle of charity, then loving one's enemies is the sublime application for that, right? So for such a virtue is one of the greatest victories attainable over selfishness and pride. So that's the Spiritism interpretation of what was being said. However, there is usually a misunderstanding as to the meaning of the word love in this context, right? So Jesus did not mean by these words that one must have for one's enemy the tenderness that one would have for a brother or a sister or a friend. Love presupposes trust, and we could not trust someone who we know means to harm us. We could not have the same effusion of friendship with such a person, knowing that he or she is capable of abusing it. Among persons who distrust one another, the bonds of affinity cannot be the same as those that exist among those who are in communion of thought. And finally, one cannot feel the same pleasure upon meeting an enemy that one feels upon meeting a friend. Okay, so notice how they're making this distinction about love, right? They're loving thy enemy. They're not asking you to welcome him into your home and be best friends with him and trust him with your bank account and to be alone with your children and all that. No, he's saying that this love is different. It's a different kind of relationship, right? Furthermore, the sentiments results from a physical law, and we're going to talk about that. The law of assimilation and repulsion of fluids. Now, if you remember in the Spirits book, we talked about fluids. We talked about the metaphysical and biology of the fluids that are responsible for our psychic mediumship and our ability to communicate with spirit, right? Because we're talking about this quote unquote essence, right? But an essence that is measurable, that is a little bit more finite, a little bit more defined. And this essence has a magnetism to it, has an electromagnetism to it. And as you've learned from my classes and from previous discussions, and even from the Spirits book, that electromagnetism has its own sort of attractions and its own repulses that are very much based on the spirit, right? What the spirit's predispositions are, what the karmic predispositions are of a spirit, etc. That's all going to inform how the fluids interact with the world and how spirits and what kind of spirits get called down that are attracted to that level of energy that flows within the fluids, right? So we know this if we've taken my classes and if we've read the Spirits book. And now you know. And so in this context, furthermore, sorry. Assimilation of the repulsion. A malevolent thought emits a fluidic current whose impression is painful. A benevolent thought envelopes you in a pleasant emanation. Hear that again, right? So this is, again, written in the 1800s. We're talking about how words can energetically change the fluids within the body. And we've seen from current scientific experimentations from Michio Kaku that is, and that does happen, whether it happens because of vocal sound affecting the water, whether it happens because the water somehow interprets language or somehow can read, or whether it's simply the energy behind the language that is being infused upon the water, does not make a difference. The difference is that it is measurable, it's reportable, it's scientific. It has passed the scientific method that water can be affected by the things that we say and the energy that we infuse upon it, right? And this book that was written in the 1800s is speaking about this from a metaphysical standpoint, right? Hence, the difference in sensation one experiences when close to a friend or an enemy. So to love one's enemy, therefore, cannot mean that one should not make a difference between them and one's friend. This precept seems difficult, even impossible to practice, only because one has wrongly believed that it is prescribing friendship and enemies as the same place in our hearts. Since the poverty of the human language forces one to use the same term to express the various nuances of sentiments, reason calls us to differentiate them according to each case, right? So again, this subject of discernment, who really is your enemy? And who really is your friend? Now, let's not forget, just because someone might have a harsher tone or because someone might be more forward in the way that they say things doesn't mean that they're an enemy, but maybe a friend who gives harsh lessons, right? These are all the nuances that they're talking about. And these nuances can only be perceived through the fluidic body, right? We talk about this with regards to our aura. We talk about this with regards to those first impressions that happen upon the skin, right? You might feel your hairs prick up, or you might feel certain things. That is all consequences, if you will, of fluidic reactions between you and your environment, between you and other spirits, okay? And to have that discernment means that you trust in those fluidic perceptions to be able to read a person. Have you ever been in a room and met someone for the first time and you just instantly was like, I don't like this person. I don't trust this person. I don't know anything about them, but I can't. There's something about them. That is you interpreting this person's energy through your fluidic energy, and you're trusting in that. You're saying this is a repulsion. This is something that I can't vibe with. And that is okay, right? And there could be a multitude of reasons as to why. We don't want to jump to conclusions, but that's where this is coming from. To love one's enemy, therefore, does not mean holding them an affection that is not natural, since contact with an enemy makes the heart beat in a much different way than does contact with a friend. It means holding neither hatred nor rancor, nor desires for vengeance against them. It means forgiving them unconditionally without ulterior motives for the harm they have caused us. It means not setting up any obstacles to reconciliation. It means wanting the good for them instead of wishing them harm. It means rejoicing instead of despairing for the good that reaches them. It means extending to them a helping hand in case of necessity. It means abstaining either in word or action from anything that might harm them. Finally, it means repaying their harm with good in everything with no intention of humiliating them. Whoever does this fulfills the conditions of the commandment, love your neighbors. Bitch, that's a hard ask. Tell me that's not a hard ask. How many of y'all, okay, you know what? I'm not even going to ask that question, because when we say the word enemy, right, that conjures up a whole lot of stuff within our mental, right? And there are people whose definition of enemy is a lot more sinister due to the experiences that they've had than, let's say, the neighbor who lets their dog shit on your yard every morning that you have to pick up, and that just infuriates you, right? So there's levels to this idea of enemy, right? And so that's a hard ask that Allan Kardec and the spirits are putting on your plate here. But it's an ask that, again, from the Spiritist perspective, right? Remember what the Spiritist perspective is. It's about reincarnation and our ability to elevate our spirits, the spirits of our deceased loved ones, and spirits that are living here on earth as well, right? It's the whole baggage. So this process is less about you and more about the totality of it all, right? This act results just by consequence, results in both your evolution and the evolution of your said enemy. Right? And that's pretty intense. That's pretty saintly, if you will, because it is a hard ask for a lot of people. Not expecting everyone to do it, but that is in there, right? So loving one's enemies is absurd to disbelievers, those for whom the present life is everything, seeing in their enemies only noxious beings who disturb their peace of mind, and from whom they believe that only death can free them. Hence the desire for vengeance. They have no interest in forgiving unless it is to satisfy their pride in the eyes of the world. In certain cases, forgiveness even seems to them like a weakness unworthy of them. Even if they do not seek outright revenge, they nevertheless harbor rancor and a secret desire for evil. For believers, and especially for spiritists, the way of seeing things is different because they consider both the past and the future, between which their present life is only a dot. So again, it's a very forward-thinking practice. It's a very forward-thinking philosophy. We're spending a lot of time here on Earth in the 3D talking about being present, right? Being present, being mindful, being present. But that is only the first step, because once you are present, you can now plan with your forethought and manifest with your forethought. But it starts first with presence, right? They know that because of their very destiny on the earth, they must expect to meet up with bad and perverse people, that the malice of which they are the target makes up part of the trials that they must undergo. And their elevated point of view renders the vicissitudes less bitter, whether they come from things or other people. If they do not complain about their trials, they also must not murmur against those who serve as their instruments. If instead of complaining, they thank God for putting them to the test, they should also thank the hand that furnishes them the opportunity to prove their patience and resignation. This thought naturally disposes them to forgiveness. And moreover, they feel that the more generous they are, the more uplifted they are in their own eyes, and they find themselves to be beyond the reach of malevolent attacks from their enemies. Persons who occupy elevated positions in the world do not feel offended by the insults of those whom they regard as their inferiors, and the same applies in the moral world for those who lift themselves above materialistic humanity. They understand that hate and rancor degrade and debase them, and therefore, to be above their adversaries, they must have bigger, nobler, and more generous souls. Let me pull out a chair real quick on this one, because Allan Kardec really needs to have a seat here, right? So, this is where people can get really out of hand with regards to the fanaticism that we see in spiritualism and in spiritism. And that fanaticism is a direct result of this moral righteousness, this intellectual righteousness, this sort of I am high vibe above the bullshit, therefore your shit just cannot touch me. We literally don't exist on the same vibe. You cannot touch me, right? This is the narrative that's being kind of spewed out there, and it's really toxic because it's giving sort of that separatism, that segregation of high vibe, low vibe, you're a bad person, I'm a good person, this whole thing. And this particular passage really kind of supports that in a very obvious sort of way. But I'm going to pick it apart for you so that you understand that when you're reading this, that is not where your head needs to go. That is not where your head needs to go, right? So this is sort of like this idea of, the lion knows that it's the king of the jungle. You're not going to hear him roaring all over the place to let everyone know, right? He's just going to be the fucking lion, right? That's sort of what's being asked of you here, right? It's not a situation in which you forgiving your neighbor or you forgiving your enemy makes you some sort of this morally righteous person that is bestowing forgiveness upon someone. You're doing them a favor, right? It's not that. Okay? And it's also not they are less than you and low vibe than you because they don't want to forgive, or because the enemy is it's just too much. It's just too much. We're not going to go there. All right. We need to remember some of the first tenets in Spiritism in the very first book. And some of those first tenets discuss how everyone is approaching their growth at their own pace. And the same way that some groups here in America and all over the world sometimes start the race at a disadvantage, it's the same thing when it comes to this spiritual school that we live in, right? There are going to be some people that kind of start off at a disadvantage, right? For whatever the reason. We don't know the story. Only God knows the story, right? So for you to feel like you're better than them, or for you to judge because they don't want to forgive their enemies, is not our place. Our place is to stay focused on our journey, help when someone asks for help, and just, do the right thing. I mean, it's really just that simple. Don't be a dick, right? Don't be a dick. So now we're going to talk about the discarnate and enemies, right? So enemies, meaning people who were your enemy in life who died. And also it can mean, other spirits that are your enemies too, but we're going to specifically talk about ones that were once living. Okay? So spiritists have still other reasons for being tolerant of their enemies. First of all, they know that maliciousness is not a permanent state for humans, that it is due to a momentary imperfection, and that just as children correct themselves of their faults, bad people will someday acknowledge their wrongs and become good. They also know that death frees them only from the physical presence of their enemies, and that their enemies can pursue them with their hatred even after having left the earth behind. That their vengeance thus fails in its objective, and to the contrary, has the effect of causing a greater irritation that can continue from one existence to the next. And this is a lot of times where people often feel like they have generational curses, right? Some of that can be because of an enemy of the family that has passed away and continues to haunt the family, among other very witchy and mystical reasons that could potentially happen. But this is one of them, right? It is Spiritism's responsibility to show, through experience and the law that governs the relations between the visible and invisible worlds, that the expression extinguishing hatred with blood is radically erroneous, and that the truth is actually that blood preserves hatred even beyond the grave. Blood preserves hatred even beyond the grave. So I'm going to throw that to you in two perspectives. The first perspective is the one that they're showing here, the first example, which is a once living enemy who is now a dead enemy, right? So that hatred lives beyond the grave. But then there is a hatred that your ancestors may have carried for a particular person, place, or thing. And so when they had their children, when they passed, now their children carries within their DNA that hatred of that particular thing. Where do you think some of your preferences come from? Where do you think some of those visceral, phobic responses come from? Right? The fear of dogs, the fear of swimming, the fear of the color purple, the fear of, where do you think that comes from? So when we talk about this in Spiritism, we're talking about the energy of hatred. We're not talking about the personality that is expressing the energy of hatred. And the energy of hatred can be carried in the DNA. Consequently, Spiritism presents a positive reason and a practical usefulness for forgiveness and Christ's sublime maxim: love your enemies. There is no heart so perverse that it would not be touched by good behavior, even without being conscious of it. Through good conduct, one can at least remove any pretext for reprisals, and can turn enemies into friends both before and after his or her death. Through bad behavior, we irritate them, and it is then that they serve as instruments of God's justice for punishing those who have not forgotten, or forgiven, not forgiven. One can therefore have enemies among both incarnates and discarnates. The enemies of the invisible world express their malevolence through the obsessions and subjugations of which so many persons are the target, and which are one variety of life's trials. Trials like these, just like other trials, help one to advance and should be accepted with resignation, and as the result of the inferior nature of the terrestrial globe. If there were no bad people on the earth, there would be no bad spirits around it. Consequently, if one must have indulgence and benevolence for one's incarnate enemies, then one must have them for those who are discarnate. In times past, blood victims were sacrificed to placate infernal gods, who were none other than evil spirits. These infernal gods were succeeded by demons, which are the same thing. Spiritism has come to show that these demons are none other than the souls of bad people who have not yet gotten rid of their material instincts, that nothing can placate them except the sacrifice of one's hatred, that is, by showing them charity. That charity not only has the effect of stopping them from practicing wrongdoing, but it also leads them to the path of the good and contributes towards their salvation. It is thus that the maxim, love your enemy, is not limited to the narrow circle of the earth and the present life, but it is part of the great law of universal solidarity and fraternity. So again, it's about forward thinking. Hey, Jaylee. Again, it's about forward thinking, right? We're not just thinking about us in the here and now on this planet. We're thinking about all of us in all times, in all planets, in all multiverses. It's a butterfly effect. All of our actions do not go without consequence, whether we see them or not, right? But I will say this. When he's talking about over here with the whole blood sacrifices to the gods, but that those gods are demons and stuff like that, again, let's remember who was writing this, when it was written, what the current, mindset was at the time, right? These are people who are white, upper echelon people. So to them, indigenous people, indigenous practices, African practices, POC practices in general were demonic and evil, period, point blank, right? So we are, this is no longer the Spiritism we work with. This is just simply where we kind of pull some of our stuff from. But we know what to leave behind, right? This next subcategory is called, if someone strikes your right cheek, offer him the other also, right? So this is a really popular one, and I love to hear the arguments among this one as well. But we're going to pick apart this particular verse. It's Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 42, right? So what it says here is, you have learned that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I am telling you not to resist the evil that others might want to do to you. But if someone strikes your right cheek, offer them the other also. And if someone wants to sue you to take your tunic, leave him your cloak also. And if someone wants to force you to go down 1,000 steps with him, go 2,000. Give to him who asks, and do not turn away someone who wants to borrow from you. All right, let's get into it, right? So the world's prejudices concerning what has conventionally been called the point of honor causes that somber susceptibility that is born from pride and the exaltation of the personality, leading people to pay back injury for injury, offense for offense, in what seems like justice to those whose moral sense has not risen above the earthly passions. That is why the Mosaic law stated an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Mind you, the Mosaic law, the eye for an eye, they're talking about Jewish people. So again, the anti-Semitic stuff, you get me. Anyway, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a law that was in harmony with the time in which Moses lived. Now, Christ came and said, repay evil with goodness, and then stated further, do not resist the evil that others might want to do to you. If someone strikes your cheek, offer him the other. To the proud, this maxim seems like cowardice, because they do not understand that there is more courage in bearing an offense than avenging oneself. And they also base their actions on the motives that keep them from seeing beyond the present. Must one take the maxim literally, however? No more than the one that says to pluck out an eye if it is a cause of a scandal, right? So taken to the extreme, it would mean condoning all repression, even when legal, and leave the field free to bad persons by removing all of their fear. If a restraint were not put on their aggressions, all good people would soon be their victims. The very instinct for self-preservation, which is a law of nature, states that one should not willingly hold one's neck out for a murderer. Thus, by these words, Jesus did not interdict self-defense, but condemned vengeance. So really pay attention to that. He's not saying don't defend yourself. He's also not saying that if you know someone is going to murder you, don't stick out your neck, or if someone's going to shoot you, don't puff out your chest. That's not what he's saying. He's simply saying, just don't act in vengeance. Don't respond in hatred. If someone is going to do something, they're going to do it. So just let it roll. That's basically what he's saying. Let it roll, right? By saying to offer one's cheek when the other has been struck, he is saying in another way that one should not repay evil with evil, that people should humbly accept everything that tends to lower their pride, that it is more glorious for one to be wounded than to wound. It is more glorious for one to be wounded than to wound. But he's not talking about going against your self-preservation. Discernment, fine line, right? To patiently bear an injustice than to commit one. That it is worthier to be deceived than to deceive. To be ruined than to ruin others. At the same time, it is the condemnation of dueling, which is no more than a manifestation of pride. Let's be real. Only faith in the future life of God's justice, which never leaves injustice unpunished, can provide the strength to patiently bear the blows directed against our interests and self-centeredness. That is why we constantly state, focus your gaze on the future ahead. The more you lift yourselves above the material through thought, the less you will be disheartened by the things of the earth. All right, so now we're on the last part of the chapter, which is only it's a bunch of pages. Okay, so we might, dear friends, have to take a break. So just keep in mind that when we meet up next week, we're going to be on chapter 12 on the Spirit's teachings, and they're going to be talking about vengeance, hatred, dueling, and of course the where is it? Oh, that's it. Those are the three. So that's what we're going to be talking about next week, okay? Any questions on what we have read tonight, what we have read in the last 3 books? Spiritism, spiritualism, espiritismo, psychic mediumship in general. Now's your time, right? This is your floor now. Yay! Oh, that's so good. Oh, I love seeing people. Hello, hello. So every Monday night, 7 p.m., we do our book club, our spiritual book club. We just read all different kinds of spiritual texts from all different kinds of practices. You know, these last couple of books, we've been focusing on Spiritism and all the books regarding that. And then we'll move on to something else. And of course, I would love to hear your input, you know, whatever books you guys recommend or whatever particular path you would like to hear more books from. Just inbox me. Let me know. All right. Thank you guys so much for stopping by my channel. Make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. This is The Magical Solution. My name is Leilani, and this is how we grow. Bye, guys.